Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where it's about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Wynonna Earp. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, obviously, we kind of get introduced to our demon, this episode being Rotten Jack, and obviously the BBD want him to be captured alive. First and foremost, we had the whole situation with Wynonna waking up at Eamon's place naked, and it was like, oh, I think that's like the most walk of shame she's ever had, you know? I think. Because obviously she was more so hurting just because of the whole, like, where her and Doc were currently, where their current standings are, so, you know. So, when that was all said and done, though, what I thought was really interesting, though, is that obviously, you know, Waverly wants to make, you know, this Halloween special because Halloween has never been special for them. You know, even later on, Wynonna's just so like, she hates this holiday. I think probably just because, like, well, you grow up dealing with demons and supernaturals and revenants and all that. Like, that's always been a part of your life. It's always been the shittiest part of your life because it's led to so many issues. It's not the only reason, but it plays a role in why their dad was such an asshole. And then on top of that, you also have the fact is that, you know, they became, you know, looked at as crazy because of everything. So obviously Halloween's not going to sit well with her. But for Waverly, she wanted to kind of take it back because their dad never really let them celebrate. So it's like, oh, let's make this holiday ours. She also wants to take this time to spend time with Wynonna because obviously where things are kind of spiraling a little bit for Wynonna because obviously they came back so much to change, and she wants to show her like where we stand won't change. Like, you're my sister, so she wants some sisterly time. But obviously, like I said, Jeremy told them like, oh, okay, we need to bring in Rotten Jack. We can't kill him, so they need to go find the extractor. Turns out the extractor's Casey. It's like, yo, my chili cooking buddy. I was like, yo. So that's pretty cool. But when the time came, obviously, because Wynonna's kind of in a bad mood because she's like, oh, you're happy and blah, 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 blah. Just let me hate this shit holiday or something like that, she would say. Basically, Wynonna's kind of a bit jealous just because, like, Waverly's happy. She's happy and in love. She's engaged. She's going to get married. Like, everything's coming up. Waverly, not so much Wynonna. And I think just this particular day, where her and Doc stand, just had sex with Eamon, and that was just kind of terrible in its own right. I think that was just, like I said, it's just a combination of everything. It's just, she wasn't in the best mood at the time. And it's just like I say, whether she says, like, you know, what she said to Eamon last episode, whether she fully believes that, like, you know, whether it's just a thing of, I'm what's necessary, or I think there's still a part of her because the way Doc feels about it, like, she feels bad how she handled the Clanton situation, but I think it's also on some level, it probably my thing is, obviously, it's a little bit of a Wyatt move, so that's why it hits Doc a little differently. But also, I'm sure maybe on Wynonna's mind, and I think you could draw these parallels, but maybe whether she has or not is something, you know, I'm curious, but I'm sure that's something that you could almost be like, that might be like a Ward move. To be fair, you know, that's how her dad died in the first place, was her shooting him in the back accidentally. You know, so, I don't know. I don't know if there's some correlation to that, you know, that could easily just be me overthinking things, but I just think maybe just in her mind it's like it bugs her more than she's letting on. She wants to be like, oh, it's I'm necessary, so what I did wasn't too bad, but I think it weighs on her what she did. I mean, this whole demon hunting and fighting thing has always weighed on her in some shape or form. Obviously it's never been easy. Let's just kind of leave it at that, you know. So, but then, like, you had Casey, like, flashing them with, like, a light, and then, like, he put on a gas mask, and he runs into this fog, and they follow, too, and they kind of get lost, but not just lost, they start losing memories of who they are. I love it's like, oh, Miss Ladybug. I was like, well, what are you going to school? And Wynonna's like, horse school? Yeah, they eventually come out not knowing anything, not remembering anything, and then they run into Casey, and he's like, oh yeah, you got so high, all your troubles went away, yeah, and it's like, I was like, huh, because at first I was wondering, like, did he not know what was happening? It's like, no, he has to know because he's lying to them about what happened, and so they kind of go in their merry way. He's like, oh yeah, I live here, you two live here, obviously they go home to the homestead and like, oh my god, do you think we're roommates? And it's like, sisters? Oh my god, and we live together. And then it's Wynonna and Waverly, and it's like, oh, Wynonna thinks Waverly is Wynonna, and Wynonna thinks that Wynonna is Waverly. So I thought that was interesting. And I was like, oh, I think I'm, Waverly's like, oh, the way I punched him, it's like, oh, I must be a cop or something like that, which is interesting, considering, Wynonna's actually, even though technically, yes, but technically, was a cop in the family, but also that's, Hot's also the cop in the family as well. So I just thought that was really interesting. Them kind of, but also it was actually, I think this episode was also to show you, like, who they are without all the bullshit. That at the end of the day, like, their circumstances, it's kind of what Waverly actually said last episode, that there's a lot of love, but it's buried under a bunch of hurt and pain. And if you take away, hurt and pride, you take away all that, and you get them in this episode, like the purest form of like, oh, we're sisters, we don't know who we are, but at the same time, like, they're having so much fun and stuff like that, so it's there. They end up running into Doc, obviously, even though they don't remember, there's still a lot of their personalities that peek through, because even Doc's like, wait, what are you guys doing here? Like, I'd rather just be alone. But then it's like, oh, obviously he figures out, like, they know nothing about demons or whatever. It's like, so it's fascinating. Which, obviously, Doc had his whole situation with Eamon, because Eamon's like, oh, you haven't brought in any alcohol. And then he also brings up the whole stuff about having sex with Wynonna. And I was like, did you think that was, like, what made you think, like, oh, like, also, who are you to think you can rein in Doc Holliday? That's also another thing, too. Like, oh, you work for me. It's like, no, I quit. Because it's like, did you think the whole, like, oh, Wynonna thing would break him? But I love that Doc laughed at him. He's like, oh, the one thing Wynonna hates more than demons is her exes. And it's like, so, like, you're kind of on the double shit list in that regard, So I thought that was interesting. But like I said, Eamon was like, oh, I bit her front and back, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what did you think was going to happen? You think he was going to stick around after that? He's like, you're right, Eamon, you're 100% right. I'm going to get back to work. Like, why were you so shocked by him just up and quitting? Because I think for Doc, it's just kind of like, all right, I'm done with your BS. I'm out, Which also, interestingly enough, he was setting up bets about who Rotten Jack was going to kill next, which he's also like, the good, saying that, like, Rotten Jack isn't aware of it. So I thought that was interesting. So even in the beginning, Eamon was like, yeah, if Rotten Jack ever found out what I was up to, he'd probably be super pissed about it. So that was kind of an interesting development. I also love Eamon finding out about Wynonna. It's like, wait, she doesn't remember who she is. They don't remember who they are. Oh my god, this is a perfect opportunity. He pretends to be her boyfriend and stuff like that. Kind of gets them back and everything. And I love the whole thing of like, all right, Doc's gone. Pumpkin Jack's out there doing his thing. The Earp sisters don't remember who they are. He's sniffing a little, I guess, crack or something else. I even love it being like, Waverly being like, I think your boyfriend's like kind of a cokehead or crackhead or something like. I think she said cokehead. And it's like, oh, Waverly, why don't you? Wynonna being like, why don't you hurry up and save me from him or something like that. So, just thought it was an interesting turn of events in that regard. Luckily, Jeremy got in contact with Doc, and he was able to convince. Doc was able to convince Casey to come help. Because for Casey, he's like, yeah, I'm writing this thing to like Wynonna and Waverly and telling them I'm sorry for what I did. But Doc, said, because for Casey, the reason why he did it was because he was scared. Like, he figured if he could make them forget, like, oh, then they will stop they won't ask me to get involved and stuff like that. Because also Wynonna is who Wynonna is. She's not very, handles things with kid gloves. It's kind of like, hey, got this gun in your face, you're going to do what I tell you to do type of thing. So Casey kind of freaked out. But Doc told him, what's the opposite of fear? It's love. And for him, he's lost a lot. It's like I lost my best friend. I never got to really even meet my daughter. But everything I've ever lost has always been like a yoke on the back of my neck. But for him, the one thing that's kept him going is his love. And the person, obviously, he's like, what I love most in this world, and what's important to him, it's always, reminds him of what's out there worth fighting for, and that's Wynonna. But he stopped himself to be like, the Earp sisters, both of them, of course. But even Casey saw through it. It's like, yeah, the gun belonging to the woman you're obviously, who's not the person that you love most in the world or whatever. It's like, yeah. Like, obviously, even Casey saw through it. So it's like, he can't bring himself to say it right now. But obviously, they've had their ups and downs. But Wynonna's always been important. She's always been special to him, you know? I think he was specifically talking about probably Wyatt. But I'd like to think on some level he was also talking about dolls. Just for my own sake, I'd like to think he was talking about dolls, just because like they had their adversities, their issues, but I think they were good buds. So I'd like to, like I said, I'm sure it's about Wyatt, but I'd like to think it's about dolls. But regardless, so he was able to kind of convince him. At the same time, Eamon is using this opportunity now that like, hey, they're all out of, you know, they don't have any memories of who they are, so I'm gonna have people bet on who's gonna whoever gets the highest bet gets to kill them. And so I love that one dude's like 1,000, and Wynonna's like, oh come on, like no, like Eamon had said like 1,000, and she's like, come on, and one of the dudes bet like 5,000, and Wynonna's like, you're cool. And then Waverly's like, they're trying to kill you. She's like, yeah, but low-key, fuck you. I love that. It's just kind of like, yeah, okay, you're betting on my life, but still, come on. Like, I'm worth more, like, lowballing it, 1,000? Really? I'm the most badass demon killer out there, 1,000? Really? You know, I love her pride had to kick in. I even love Waverly trying to bet like 10,000 or whatever, and I love home dude that bet what was it, like bet a sum too, and the dude was like, oh, this is this, and he's like, my name is Remy, but Eamon was like, I don't care, which I think is funny, and I think this speaks volumes that when Doc came in, he was like, Remy. So it's like Doc remembers everyone's name. You can't remember everyone. I just thought that was so fascinating. But when it was all said and done, like Jeremy showed up to make the bet, and at the same time, Rotten Jack showed up. Obviously, the bet landed on the Angel. Only the crew knows about that Waverly's the Angel in town. And so what I thought was so fascinating was, obviously, Jeremy reveals himself, because I love that it's like, oh, he had told Doc there'd be a signal, and it was the junk. It's like, right, that was his thing. He always knew that being the thing, because it's like, and even Doc be like, hey, there was the signal, because it's like, yeah, like, that would always be, like, that would always be his thing. Like, he could fill it in his junk if something was happening to Doc, if Doc wasn't okay, you know, so I like that. But he ended up being able to restore Wynonna and Waverly's memory. Granted, they had to deal with Rotten Jack without killing him, busted his head open, and then, like, you know, Casey was like, no, this is my job, like, if you stick your hand in there, it'll burn. Which I'm wondering, considering Waverly's half angel, would that have been the case? But, like, he reaches in there and pulls out a little candle, and obviously Waverly blows it out, killing Rotten Jack, and he just falls over. And so, I don't know whether, like, because they didn't really go into, like, what he does as the extractor. Is it supposed to be, like, he extracted, like, Rotten Jack's like essence or soul in that moment? Is that what he does? Like, because it was basically like another dimension inside of his head as it was cracking open. So I'm more, like they said, he never really went into what Casey's whole thing is as the extractor. Also, like, what that whole light show he used, like, does he have like, is that just like supernatural weapons and stuff he has canned up? Or does it just supernatural stuff he has canned up that he uses as the weapon? They really didn't go into any of that, like what that light was, you know. I guess he had some idea of what the fog was to know to put on a gas. I guess he saw people wander through it enough to know, like, oh, you need to have a gas mask because you don't want to inhale that stuff. So that was kind of an interesting development. A lot of other interesting things we found out that the fog isn't something BBD's been working on. It's actually something they've been studying for months. It turns out that fog is actually potentially bleeding in from the garden. So I'm assuming because of the timeline and everything, it's not because, like, oh, when they left the garden, they left the door open, because obviously they were going for like a year or so. The fact is, I think it's probably supposed to signify, like, that when the whole bull shard situation, the moment the garden was open, like the door was, even though it closed behind Doc when he was going in, that it kind of stayed open enough that like once open, like some of the fog probably seeped out, and so it's been seeping out the entire time, and that's what it is. Which is also interesting because let's not forget the moment Julian crossed the border of like the Ghost River Triangle, he ended up forgetting who he was, you know, so makes you wonder, is there has to be a correlation in that. Maybe. I mean, because that's also an interesting thing too, like, if this is something from the garden, does that mean, like, that's why it's interesting, because it affected Waverly, so it's like, well, for one, it's like, obviously, we've seen there's still things that affect even the Earp heir, but it's also interesting that something from the garden can affect her like that. I mean, to be fair, the garden isn't what, I mean, everyone thought the garden would be. Obviously, it's not, so more so a prison than anything else, so I'm wondering if this is also going to be their way to kind of bring that back full circle, because, like, we haven't dealt with the garden stuff since the beginning of the season, since Doc, Waverly, and Wynonna got out of the garden. Like, we have not touched on any of that. So that's why I'm wondering, is it a circumstance of, like, that's going to be, like, the ultimate thing, especially with this fog. The fog might be indication that the garden is bleeding over into this world, and that maybe, like, them escaping kind of left the door a lot more open. So we'll kind of have to wait and see where things kind of go in that regard. I'm sure we're definitely not done with Eve. I figured as much when they introduced her. I was like, oh, we're not done with her. So I think she's going to ultimately be like the main antagonist at the end of the season. But, you know, like I said, we'll have to ultimately wait and see on that front. But, like, we finally get answers to the whole Robin thing, because obviously Jeremy's got his appointment, and the dude Albert's like, hey, you know, because Naomi's kind of, you know, on leave right now because she thought she saw, like, what, a boy's a Bigfoot or something. She started crying and basically had a breakdown. So Albert's kind of taking over, and it's like, oh, you need to kind of get on top of that, you know, before we go into lockdown. But, like, Jeremy's like, I don't ask for much. 1 hour a week, like, this is my time. So he goes into this meeting and he meets up with Robin, and Robin doesn't remember a lot. Like, obviously there's little bits here and there, but what was really showed that was, obviously, it's like, oh yeah, I missed my dad's funeral. Like, I don't know whether it's like he's remembered bits and pieces, or whether it's a situation where they kind of gave him a fake life, because, like, he's quote unquote an accountant at Black Badge. But what was interesting, though, is, like, obviously when Jeremy was going to go meet with Doc, he's like, yeah, I'm going to meet with the guy who's a mystery, an enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a, under a mustache or something like that. And Robin's like, yeah, I know what you mean on that front. And then Jeremy was like, wait, what? Because let's not forget it, Jeremy had a mustache at that time, so it's like, of course, like, that's what Robin's kind of correlating to, so it's interesting. But I think on some level, Jeremy probably blames himself for what, no, I think so, he blames himself for what happened to Robin, because they didn't know what happened to the others, so he wanted Robin to look for him, so Robin jumped out and was he jumped out into the fog, and he was lost in there for weeks. And because of that, he's in the situation he's in. So slowly but surely, every time he's at one of these meetings, he's slowly been dosing Robin with these. And it seems like it is helping to a certain extent, but it's like, who knows if this is permanent or not. Like, once again, the longer you're in there, the more damage it causes, because luckily Wynonna and Waverly were only in there probably like a few minutes at most. So it was reversible, but, you know, that doesn't mean that at the end of the day, like, you know, Robin's situation is, because we find out, like, why he looks different and everything. It's because he tried to, when they found him, he had torn his face off. So, and for Jeremy, it's like, I don't care, you know, if he has a new face, if he ends up being with someone else, I just want him to be happy, you know? And I think that hearing that side of things from Jeremy, for one, to know that he's been carrying this all on his own this entire time, it's like, we'll find a way to help, but it's like, Wynonna, the fog is spreading, so eventually it's going to get to the point that it consumes all of Purgatory. So I think that's going to be an interesting development in its own right. But I think hearing that from Jeremy, you know, it probably cleared Wynonna's mind a little bit, a lot of stuff. probably made her think of Waverly, Nicole, and like, Doc, about just kind of where things kind of set on a lot of fronts. And even hearing that story they were telling about their dad, about like how he did, like she wanted to be a scarecrow for Halloween, so Wynonna stole like some for their dad's like clothes, and like stole some straw, and she brought it to school for Waverly to wear, and their dad locked her in like, what was it, like the cellar or something, for 3 days as punishment. And it's like, well, fuck him, because you look cute and you finally were able to get candy. So kind of showing, their upbringing, because even Waverly was like, Dad was right, nothing good happens on Halloween. But also I appreciate Nicole showing back up, because this is actually what Waverly brought up at the beginning of the episode of like, oh, like kind of bring back the khakis, and she's wearing a uniform and everything. And I love Wynonna being like, oh, this is a porno. Oh, great. This is happening right beside me. Oh, great. Oh, this is awesome. But also, her and Waverly had that bonding moment of like, yeah, I'm getting married. Things between you and me will never change, because you have always been and you will always be my hero. I was like, I like I said, even though they didn't have their memories, there was still that moment. Because even when they're about to die, it's like, you're the best sister I've ever had. And she's like, how do you know? And Wynonna was like, I know. And I was like, oh, that's, like I said, it's just, I think that's also a point in this episode too, that even, without the hurt, without all the pride and everything, like, it's just, it's clear cut of just, the sisterly bond that they love each other so much, and they always will, no matter what happens. So, it's like, oh, can I steal her away for a minute? And Wynonna's like, a minute? You better make her happy for the rest of her damned life. And it's like, Nicole's like, I will. So, and even Waverly will be like, you can call Doc. So once again, now that the hurt and pride is back, it's like, where they currently stand is going to be interesting. But you have Doc dragging Eamon back in front of everybody, and it's like, oh, like he tilted the game, because he was like, yeah, he was saying like, yeah, Eamon cheated the game, because what did he, yeah, he had Waverly dressed up as an angel, and the dude, Remy, was like, yeah, I mean, Waverly's cute, but an angel? Wink, wink. To be fair, Eamon didn't know she was an angel, so he wasn't expecting Rotten Jack to show up. But it kind of works in his Doc's favor to be like, yeah, see, he kind of literally threw you to the wolves. Especially when he went in there and locked the door to make sure it's like, oh, Rotten Jack could have potentially killed us all. But it's like, do whatever you want to with them. I almost thought Doc was going to be like, oh, I'll be your boss now. Like, I thought that was potentially where that was going to go, where they were going to like be like, hey, like, he's like, oh, this is my crew now? Thought that's where it was going to go? Totally didn't. It's like, I'm not your boss. Do whatever you want to. You're free to do it. And they're like, free? All right, let's do it. So, ripped him to pieces. We don't ate him. Whatever the case may be. Eamon potentially finally got his. So, we'll see kind of where things kind of go going forward. Are we going to see a lot more of the extractor Casey? This fog situation, what that ultimately ends up turning into, where things stand between Wynonna and Doc. Obviously, there's the whole Clanton's thing. Cleo, obviously, they're unaware, but she's over there plotting, got her own plans. Granted, her plans might amount to nothing with whatever this whole garden situation ultimately ends up being with the fog and everything, because that might be a hindrance. It might play a role in what's to come. Well, hell, that might be their way of actually dealing with that. Rather than killing Cleo, they might just wipe her memories of the Clantons, and she kind of gets a fresh start in that regard. That might be potentially how they handle that. Maybe, maybe not. Well, like I said, we'll ultimately have to wait and see. But I'm really interested to see where the next episode takes us going forward with all of this. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.